Howka everyone, Dr. David Breckner here. I am the Executive Director of the Imperial Valley Desert Museum. Today, we will be exploring identity and what that means within society and the law, specifically civil rights. The Kumeyaay are the indigenous people that have lived and currently live in San Diego County, Imperial County, and Baja California, Mexico for over 10,000 years. The traditional lands the Kumeyaay inhabit are among the most geographically diverse landscapes of any culture group in the Americas. Their geographical territories included the coast of the Pacific Ocean, mountains, valleys, deserts, and the shores of ancient Lake Cahuilla, including present-day Salton Sea. Let's turn over to Charles to get us started with today's lesson.
Howka, I'm Charles, and I'm the Education Specialist here at the Imperial Valley Desert Museum. The Kumeyaay have faced many challenges and adversities from other groups, such as the Mexican government, the Spanish, American settlers, and the U.S. government. The Kumeyaay and other indigenous groups have not been alone in their struggle for civic justice and equality. It has been a common theme among minority groups across the nation. The civil rights movement, led most famously by Martin Luther King Jr., was a struggle for justice and equality for African Americans during the 1940s through 1960s. Women's suffrage, the right for women to vote, was a movement that lasted from 1840 to 1920. Today, we will be focusing on the struggle for justice and equality for the Kumeyaay and indigenous populations of the United States. Currently, many members of the Kumeyaay Nation live on sections of their traditional lands that have been designed for their use by the state and federal government called reservations. These reservations are identified as sovereign nations, meaning each has its own government and constitution, separate but protected by the United States. Even though they are sovereign nations, the Kumeyaay people in the U.S. are still citizens, although this has not always been the case. Generation of indigenous voices, resilience, and efforts for civic justice and equality has made this possible. Before the introduction of international borders and state lines, the Kumeyaay moved freely across their 3 million acres of land of Alta and Baja California, which they resided in for over the last 10,000 years. From the coast, across mountains, valleys, and deserts, the Kumeyaay moved and traded amongst themselves and neighboring tribes. The Kumeyaay are very social and community-oriented with a rich culture of games, traditions, and ceremonies. The Kumeyaay respected each other, and they respected the land, knowing that the resources they had were a gift, and therefore connected them to the earth and where they came from. This traditional Kumeyaay way of life would soon change, however, with the introduction of outside influences.
The Spaniards first sailed into California, here at Point Loma, alongside the Pacific coast. When the Kumeyaay and the Europeans first made contact, hostility was not immediate, and response to the newcomers varied among the Kumeyaay.
Many accounts show that the Kumeyaay and the Spanish engaged in trading goods and services. Spaniards had advanced technology that was new to the Kumeyaay, while the Kumeyaay had skills and knowledge of the area they would use to provide the Spaniards with food and teach them the way of the land. This eventually led to the spread of Spaniard culture and influence.
The Kumeyaay way of life was met with drastic changes and challenges when Spanish missions like this one began to rise. This outside threat of influence and control from the Spaniards was met with mixed feelings from the Kumeyaay. Some Kumeyaay people wanted no part in the Spanish way of life, while others were interested if not compelled. One thing we know for sure is the Kumeyaay people and their traditional way of life was in danger. The first mission established in 1769 was a precursor to many more to come. The spread of Christianity among the Kumeyaay came at a cost for them to embrace their beliefs, religion, and culture.
This represented the first organized challenge to indigenous identity and recognition with an ever-growing new regional authority. The Kumeyaay were treated mostly as laborers for the Spanish, and some left their normal ways of life completely. In most cases, missionaries forced Kumeyaay to abandon their homes and live on missions, leaving their family and traditions behind to adopt Christian values. Kumeyaay that wished to leave the missions or practice their traditional ways were often captured and punished. Since the Spanish were primarily on the coast, those Kumeyaay that defied them were pushed to move into hills and continue their traditions in secret. After the Mexican Revolution, the Mexican government gave land grants of the lands the mission were built on to wealthy Mexican and Anglo-American settlers to create large ranchos, using the Kumeyaay as their labor force once again. Tensions rose to the point that the California and Mexico Kumeyaay united to remove the rancheros and reclaim their land. However, the Mexican-American War, in which some indigenous groups fought, shifted Kumeyaay traditional territory once again, this time into the hands of the American government.
The U.S. government and the California legislature subjected the Kumeyaay and other indigenous tribes to various acts, treaties, and laws that continuously failed to recognize their human rights and equality. In 1850, California legislature passed the Government and Protection of Indians Act. The title of this act was very misleading. Although it mentions the protection of indigenous people, the act was created for the interest and protection of American settlers. The result of the law forced much of the indigenous population into servitude. The law provided for the forced labor of loitering or orphaned Native Americans, regulated their employment, and defined a special class of Indian crimes with punishments. In 1851, Congress passed the Indian Appropriations Act, which created the Indian reservation system and provided funds to move indigenous tribes onto farming reservations to try and keep them under control.
In 1854, Dred Scott, an African-American slave, appealed to the Supreme Court for his freedom. The Supreme Court issued a decision on March 6, 1857. Delivered by Chief Justice Roger Taney, the Supreme Court declared that African Americans, whether free or enslaved, were not citizens of the United States and could not sue in federal courts.
The 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, ratified in 1868, granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including former slaves, and guaranteed all citizens equal protection under the law. Unfortunately, these rights specifically excluded Native people. The Kumeyaay and fellow indigenous groups actively resisted the restrictions imposed on them and made constant efforts to reclaim the rights that were forcibly taken from them. One of the ways they did this was through the Mission Indian Federation.
The Mission Indian Federation was a grassroots political organization established by California indigenous tribes to fight for the indigenous rights and freedoms. The Mission Indian Federation consisted of participating tribes from across the Southern California region, including the Kumeyaay, Luiseño, Cahuilla, Serrano, Cupeño, Tungva, and Nachaman. Dozens of captains from each of the Indian reservation bands of Mission Indians came together to represent their people in their fight for equality and recognition under the law. The Mission Indian Federation's efforts extended primarily across the 1920s to the 1960s and addressed a wide range of social and political issues, including civil rights, land claims, ocean tideland claims, and the preservation of lost or threatened traditional hunting, fishing, spiritual, and religious grounds. Their motto was human rights and home rule. Together, these generations of indigenous leaders in California sought and fought for U.S. citizenship, for native-born Americans, sovereignty on reservation lands, and the right of self-determination to decide their own lives without interference. Today, we continue to be shapers of our own personal environment. We are born into, nurtured within, and exist as extensions of that environment, gifted with the desire to know, learn, and grow. Like all things in life, the dynamics of culture are inclusive and their boundaries are limitless. The heart and soul of the culture of a people begins with their spiritual, religious, and moral beliefs, shaped by their social and physical environment. The traditional indigenous Kumeyaay peoples lived within these parameters, just as we continue to live within ours today.
In 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act, an all-inclusive act, was passed by Congress. The privileges of citizenship were still largely governed by state law, and often Native Americans were denied the right to vote. Their voting rights were not protected until 1965 with the passing of the Voting Rights Act. However, their right to vote was still trying to be suppressed, just like with the African American population, through poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation.
A significant triumph in indigenous rights and legislation was the establishment of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriations Act, NAGPRA, in 1990. NAGPRA was created to establish indigenous rights and extend those rights to protect indigenous burial grounds and sacred sites. It serves as a federal recognition to the Kumeyaay and indigenous groups that their deceased and sacred objects are as important as anyone else's and are equally deserving of respect.
The challenges, struggles, and efforts the Kumeyaay, fellow indigenous groups, and other groups in the United States have encountered in their fight for justice and equality is still an ongoing issue, but has a bright future towards change and inclusiveness. Currently, we are seeing a resurgence of Indigenous pride and identity through state and federal recognition of lands, celebration of Indigenous Peoples Day, and preservation of culture for future generations.